there has been a change in the college football playoff selection committee, and I think it's for the better. If you don't know, there are 13 people that make up the college football playoff selection committee, and they all fall into one of four categories. They are athletic directors, former coaches, former players, and former media. And with the changes in the last week or so, there's been a change in number of athletic directors and number of former head coaches. Pat Chun was the former athletic director at Washington State. He's taking over at Washington, and in his eyes, that's a lot to do. So he left the college football playoff committee, and they replaced him with Mike Riley, the former Oregon State and Nebraska head coach, which I think is a good move. When you look at who is on the college football playoff committee and who should make up the college football playoff selection committee, I think I have an opinion on what it should look like. But right now, there are 6 ADs, and they are all Power 5 except for one, the athletic director at Miami University, Miami of Ohio, is on the list. And I think that's a good situation to have. I think that's a good idea to have a non-Power 5 athletic director, because like it or not, the college football playoff selection committee, I believe, and you can probably argue differently, and I would listen to your argument, I think they're all pulling in the same direction, right? Like they all want, in the past, the best 4 teams in the playoff, and going forward, the best 12 teams, best 14 teams, eventually probably best 16 teams in the college football playoff. That's what their goal is. Now, whether they all agree on that or whatever the case may be, I think it's important to, one, have a non-Power 5, Power 4 athletic director in that group, because, one, he can go back and kind of report to the folks who aren't generally represented with a seat at the table of what's going on. And I think it's important for the group of 5 to have that representation and to bring in a little bit different of a viewpoint and a voice. But the other ADs are, Baylor, Virginia, Michigan, Navy. So there are some Arkansas. So there are some big time programs, but not the biggest of the big time programs in that room. There are 3 former coaches on the selection committee, and there's going to be 4 when Mike Riley joins. Gary Pinkel, Toledo and Missouri; Chris Alt, Nevada; Jim Grobe was the head coach at Wake Forest, was the head coach at Baylor for a year after things went sideways at Baylor under Art Briles. So some guys that are super accomplished coaches that are on the selection committee. My argument, I think, is that there should be an even split of athletic directors and former coaches, because I think there needs to be some check and balance in the room of, some people are going to prioritize. For instance, if you're a Power 4 athletic director, you are really concerned about revenue generation and profit and loss and notoriety and TV deals and things like that. Where former coaches are going to be concerned about football, who are the best teams, who has my respect, and obviously that's gonna be different person by person. That's why you get as many of those guys in the room as you can get. I think that's an important aspect to have, because if you are an athletic director or you're a former media member or something like that, you can defer to Jim Grobe, to Mike Riley, to Chris Alt, to Gary Pinkel. These are well-respected people who can tell you, okay, here's the good, here's the bad, here's why this team is better than that team, etc. And I think that's an important aspect to have. So the more of those voices you can have that don't have necessarily a ton of skin in the game, right? Like Jim Grobe was the head coach at Ohio and Wake Forest. Probably one, not going to really be knocking on the door of college football playoff selection, but then also doesn't have an affinity dedication to one school, where Chris Alt maybe does have that because he was at Nevada for 100 years. But some of these coaches that, if you get, for instance, someday if Lane Kiffin, who was the head coach at Tennessee and USC and Ole Miss and Florida Atlantic, and doesn't have an allegiance to any of them, that's a good voice to have in the college football playoff selection group. And if you can have more of those voices, I think that is really, at the end of the day, a really good thing, because if you have a coach who was primarily focused defensively, they can be a voice of reason in that room, or a coach who did things one way or another way. Those are really important, well-respected people to have that are going to command the room to say, hey, here's why I feel the way I do about this team or that team, or even a player by player, coach by coach, position by position situation. They're going to know the sport. They're going to recognize greatness probably faster, better, and easier than anybody else in the room. And when that's kind of what you're trying to get to, of, hey, here's the situation, here's why I think this school is better than this school, or here's why this defense is better than that defense, or who matches up well against one another, etc. It matters at the end of the day. I'm not as cynical as some other people who are like, it's a TV show at the end of the day. Like, well, yeah, technically, but at the same time, you're kind of basically tearing down the integrity and character of 13 people, and by proxy the NCAA at the same time, by just saying all they care about is inviting the biggest brands, so ESPN's happy that the biggest teams are playing and not the best teams, blah, blah, blah. I think all that stuff goes out the window when you get to 12, when you get to 14. I don't think that matters as much. And so I don't think you're going to see these drastic, wild changes in who does qualify and who doesn't qualify for the playoff beginning this upcoming season. I just don't think you're going to see that. But then at the same time, if you flood that room full of basically 50-50, and not 50-50, but an equal amount of athletic directors who have kind of their own I don't even know what to. They're going to look out for number one first, right? And whether number one is their university or their conference, they're going to look out for number one. And I'm not necessarily saying that every coach is going to be completely unbiased, but they're going to be less biased than people who are actively working in the industry to try to create more revenue and screw up the sports that we love, where retired coaches are going to just flat out tell you, like, here's who's good at football and here's who's not. Here's who's better at this than somebody else. And I think having that expert analysis, expert opinion in the room is really important. At the same time, there are two former players on the college football playoff selection college football playoff selection committee, two college football Hall of Famers, and Randall McDaniel and Willie Shields is on. And I think there might, like, if you get two or three of those, I think that's a good thing, because when you can have people who are recently detached from the sport, it's one of my somewhat criticisms of like analysts now, where, for instance, like Boomer Esiason and Phil Simms are not going to be on the NFL Today on CBS this upcoming season. They got the boot, and people were upset. Like, okay, Phil Simms stopped playing professional football 35 years ago. Boomer Esiason stopped playing in the NFL 28 years ago. That's a really long time to be detached from the sport. It has changed dramatically. In NASCAR for a while there on Fox Sports, Darrell Waltrip had retired from the sport like 25 years ago. And the technology, everything changes. And this is not running down Willie Shields or Randall McDaniel, because they're obviously, legends of the sport. But if you could have a recently departed player, or somebody who's just now joining just ended their pro football career and still wants to be involved in the game somehow, some way, this is a good spot. Like, you can still be in that room and say, like, hey, listen, I got a pretty good view of maybe some things that some other people in this room don't have, because I was just in this situation. And I think that's another important voice to have, because if you have just a bunch of old people who are somewhat detached from the game, I think admitting that, hey, this person who was just doing this, and what they think, what their viewpoint on it is a good one to have. And then finally, this was probably controversial, I don't know that the average person knows that there's a former media member on the college football playoff selection committee. Kelly Whiteside wrote for USA Today as a college football writer for like a decade and a half, and she is on the she's on the panel. She's a professor at Columbia, which might not be the most popular college to be a professor at right now, but I actually like the idea of a former media member being on the panel, because getting to a big spot in media generally requires you to think differently than everybody else, because like being a sports talk radio host or being a sports TV panelist, while I can 100% understand if you're like, they're the stupidest people on the planet, because I think they can be at times, you get to that point because you don't view everything the same way everybody else does. And that's part of the challenge of like, okay, if you're going to talk about some topic, it's really easy to have this same baseline take as everybody else. You have to think about things differently. And if you are in a room where you're trying to pick the 11 best college football teams, and if there's consensus, if there's one person that has the ability to go like, well, actually think about it this way, think about it differently, think about it, you were looking at it from this point of view, look at it from this point of view, I think that's a good person to have in the room. Now, I don't know that I want to get to a point where like, okay, the college football playoff committee is made up of 3 players, 4 former coaches, 4 former AD, 4 ADs, and Stephen A. Smith or Colin Cowherd. Like, I don't know that I want that necessarily, but I do think there should be somebody there that can challenge people if they are, because I think at the end of the day, you should be able to stand behind why you feel the way you do. And if you're to say, okay, well, why do you think team number 11 is team number 11 and not this team? Why do you think the last person in, the last school in, the last program, last 3 programs in, and the 3 programs out, why do you feel the way you do? And defend your thesis, defend why you feel the way you do. Because while uncomfortable, you have to be able to defend why you feel the way you do. When you choose Alabama with 1 loss and leave out Florida State that's undefeated, you have to defend why you feel the way you do. And if you let one person speak for the committee and they come out and like, yeah, we just really, we feel Alabama's pretty good. Why? Well, we just think Alabama's better than Florida State. Okay, why do you feel that way? Well, Alabama, they had a real good season. Okay, you still haven't answered the question. So I think, one, having somebody in there who can kind of pester whoever the hell's going to be the spokesperson for like, you're going to be asked this question and you have to have a really good answer. Because if you don't, we look stupid. And I don't know about you, or I don't know anybody who's in the business of wanting to look stupid. So one, having a media member in there challenging people to, okay, I need you to explain why you feel the way you do. Think about it differently. But also, this is going to be a question you're going to be asked. And in the past, sometimes the spokesperson doesn't handle those situations very well. And if you can train them up a little bit, like for instance, a few years ago, Ohio State and Alabama were in the running for the final spot. Alabama was not going to play in the SEC championship game. Ohio State was. Ohio State wins the championship game. Alabama does nothing that weekend. Alabama, and going into the weekend, the spokesperson, who I forget, it might have been Kirby Hocutt, I don't remember, said, it's a razor thin margin. It's so incredibly close. Right now, this is how we've got it, but I don't know, man. It's really tight. Like literally said razor's edge. Alabama sits at home, does nothing in the conference championship game. Ohio State wins a conference championship game and doesn't get in. Obviously, that razor's edge, razor thin, that's not true. If with a 13th data point, that's still not enough to jump over somebody with a 12. You're going to be asked difficult questions that you have to be able to answer quickly and without word salad and things like that. And so I think, one, having somebody in that group to say, hey, this is a question you're going to get asked, because that's not the realm that ADs, former coaches, former players know really well. And so while you might discount like that former media member having an opinion on who should or shouldn't be in the college football playoff, it's an important person to have in the room, at least, to say, if you all feel this way, that's fine. But if somebody's to pester you to get to why you feel that way, do you have an adequate answer? Because for the college football playoff to work, it still has to there has to be credibility, and there has to be trust in the people selecting the teams, because otherwise there's going to be a push, and they might be right. There's going to be a push to bring the BCS back and just say, to hell with people. We're going to do this by computers, and we're going to punch all the numbers in, and the 12 teams, the 14 teams that get in, or the 14 teams that get in, sorry about your luck. So I think if you're going to continue to be a human-led organization, which in 2024, with the rise of AI and all that stuff, like I think you kind of got to fight off the idea of turning this into a computer-led thing. I think having a media member in that room is an undeniable good thing. But we'll see if anything changes. I like the idea of more coaches. I think Mike Riley jumping in for an athletic director is probably a good switch, because, like I said, I think the college coaches, the former coaches, are a good resource to have when you're trying to figure out who's better than who should be ranked where. Why is this team at number 7 when you could argue they should be number 13? I think you got so many different things going on at once. Having more than just athletic directors in the room is a really good thing to have. That'll do it for today's episode of the Daily Huddle. Appreciate you making us a part of your day, however it is, wherever it is you're doing so. If you are watching on YouTube, hit the subscribe button. Make sure you're getting all the great college football content that we're pumping out here on Saturday Glory. If you are listening on the podcast feed, drop a 5-star review. It goes a long way in helping out the channel. I will see you tomorrow for another episode of the Daily Huddle here on Saturday.